Winston as Churchill, The World Crisis, Volume 5, Chapter 19, Beyond the Dardanelles. Falkenhayn was a convinced and inveterate Westerner. He believed that any great offensive against Russia would evaporate in the immense indefinite regions and measureless recesses to which the Russian armies could retire. Constantly before his mind's eye rose the warning pictures of the fate of Napoleon's Grand Army in the invasion of 1812. He did not choose to remember that Napoleon had no railways which could continually nourish large armies 1,000 or 2,000 miles from their home base and provide them with shelter from the winter and well-stocked depots at every stage of their advance. All his heart was in the war in France and Flanders. There alone, in his view, could the supreme struggle be decided. There was the proper and official theatre of war. There alone could orthodox military principles receive their satisfaction. These strong professional views he shared with his leading opponents, with Joffre, with French, and after French with Haig. Better, he might almost have exclaimed, be defeated in adhering to sound military doctrine than conquer by irregular methods. However, as we have seen, the power and fame of Hindenburg, reinforced by the obtrusive influence on the politicians, had overruled his better judgment, forced him to smirch the purity of his creed and make submission to the evil thing. The forecourse which he had longed to hurl into a new offensive in the West had been wrested from him. They had marched and fought in the winter battle, gaining new cheap laurels for his dangerous rivals, but producing, as he had predicted, no decisive strategic result. What was he to do? He must call a new army into being to replace the legions torn from his command. On February 22 he confabulated with Colonel von Vriesberg, the head of the organizing department of the Ministry of War, upon the creation of a new reserve. New 9-battalion divisions were to be formed by taking 3 battalions from each of the divisions on the Western Front, and by reducing the number of guns in the batteries from 6 to 4 and so on. The weakened divisions were each to be compensated with 2,400 trained recruits and additional machine guns. This transformation was expected to take from 6 to 8 weeks, and when completed Falkenhayn hoped to have at his disposal a free striking force of 24 new divisions. Actually, from lack of equipment and other causes, he had to content himself with 14, fit for service at the beginning of April. Upon these 14 he was already building his plans. They should be formed into an 11th Army with the highly competent Colonel von Seeckt, afterwards better known as its Chief of Staff under some figurehead. Early in March he set Seeckt, Kraft, Kuhl, and Tappen to find the best place in the Anglo-French line for striking the longed-for blow. They made profound studies, replete with details and time plans, of the requisite number of divisions and guns. Seeckt selected that same front from Arras to the Somme, which Ludendorff from 50 miles further back was to attack in 1918. Hohenborn, the war minister, concurred in this, holding that it was the northern wing of the enemy front in the first place, that is, the British forces, which should be broken and crushed. The right flank of the British then, near La Bassée, was to be assailed, and they were to be pushed northwest towards Boulogne and Calais, while a left-handed stroke swept the French to the southward. All these plans so busily prepared came to naught. Once again the East prevailed, but this time it was not the influence of Hindenburg and Ludendorff, but the force of events which plunged Falkenhayn into a new desertion of his favorite theories. On February 18 a numerous and powerful British fleet, supported by a French squadron, opened fire upon the outer forts of the Dardanelles. The 2 seaward forts of the Gallipoli Peninsula were much damaged, and their guns were destroyed the next day by landing parties from the ships. As each successive day deliberate and methodical long-range bombardments accompanied by sweeping operations took place, it became evident that a serious attempt was to be made to force the Dardanelles. If this should succeed, Constantinople, with the only Turkish magazines and arsenals, would fall into the power of the victors, and the best that could be hoped for was that the young Turk leaders would evacuate European Turkey and continue the struggle as a purely Asiatic power. Thus the only ally the Teutonic empires had gained would be irretrievably broken. Even more serious would be the political consequences. The spoils of the Turkish Empire would be at the disposal of the Allies. They could offer to Italy, Greece, and Romania, all three already trembling on the verge of joining them, ample and highly coveted rewards. They could act upon Bulgaria both by the threat of isolation amid a hostile Balkan peninsula and by potent bribes. The reactions of the British thrust at Constantinople were immediately apparent upon all these four states. The demands of Italy and her preparations developed apace. Greece, torn between King Constantine and Venizelos, was apparently ready to supply an army to attack the Gallipoli Peninsula. King Ferdinand talked about joining the Allies and refused to receive General von der Goltz in audience. Romania froze into silence. Falkenhayn was forced to face the prospect of a complete adverse Balkan bloc which had everything to gain from the ruin of the Turkish and Austro-Hungarian empires. But all these direct impending consequences were in their turn dwarfed by the effect on Russia of full intimate contact with England and France, should the British Navy achieve the entry and command of the Black Sea. Russian troops would then flow freely southwards to animate the Balkan Confederacy. British and French munitions, with the world markets on the oceans behind them, would revive and multiply the Russian armies. How to stop it? There were the strong defenses of the Dardanelles, the forts, the mobile armaments, the minefields, the adverse current, the great hazard of the adventure. It was a long-respected maxim that ships could not fight forts, but supposing the ships had guns which could destroy the forts, and the forts had no guns which could reach the ships while so engaged, such a theory would evidently require modification. But worse lay behind. The power of the fortress cannon against the British fleet was severely measured by their supplies of armor-piercing shells. When these were exhausted, the forts had spoken their last word, and the advancing fleets would sweep the minefields, no doubt with loss, but also with certainty. Falkenhayn learned with distaste that the forts were ill supplied with heavy ammunition, and particularly with armor-piercing shells, and that no reserve of mines existed. On March 10, Admiral von Usedom, the German officer who had been appointed to command the water defenses of the straits, telegraphed, "Despite the relatively small success of the enemy, the overwhelming of all the Dardanelles works cannot be prevented indefinitely, unless the munitions and mines now on order for months arrive soon, or the defense is sustained by submarines from home waters." It could not take less than 2 months for submarines dispatched from Kiel to make the perilous voyage. As for the shells and mines, how were they to reach the scene? Serbia was unconquered. Romania, though professing friendship, was unwilling to transport munitions. In fact, although officers in plain clothes could travel to and fro across the neutral barrier, no munitions were allowed to pass from Germany to Turkey for nearly 8 months. But who could tell what might happen in 6 weeks? All these pressures developed upon the high strategic mind of Germany during February, March, and April. On March 18, the hostile fleet made what appeared to be a resolute attempt to force the passage of the straits. The great ships engaged the forts with vigor and beat their gunfire down. The sweepers advanced towards the vital, irreplaceable barrier of Mainz. However, luckily for OHL, footnote, Oberste Heeresleitung, the German GHQ, end of footnote, the last spare handful of mines had been laid parallel to the course of the fleet in an area which it had believed was swept, and 2 or 3 ships were sunk, one French ship with heavy loss of life. The British fleet, having itself suffered a loss of some 40 lives, then withdrew, apparently baffled, from the contest, and the intelligence reports informed Berlin that a considerable army was collecting in Egypt for a land attack on the Gallipoli Peninsula in concert with a renewed attack by the fleet. On the other hand, it was stated that as the Russians had now laid claim to Constantinople, the British were no longer in earnest about forcing the Dardanelles. As to the land attack, the Turks, who had now crowded into the Gallipoli Peninsula and were under the command of General Liman von Sanders, professed confidence. But the difficulty about stopping the fleet consisted in the fact that the minefields could not be renewed if damaged in any way, and that there were less than 50 large armor-piercing shells for all the decisive guns of the forts together. We can see these 2 opposing sets of circumstances maturing simultaneously in Falkenhayn's mind. The 11th Army gathering for use in the west, and this horrible intrusion upon Turkey from the southeast Mediterranean. In the fine brain of the Supreme Commander, the 2 principles fought for mastery. In the end he decided of his own free will that the most urgent task was to crush Serbia and to open a road for munitions to Constantinople and the Dardanelles. Thus, by the beginning of April, when the new 11th Army was in being, Falkenhayn had already abandoned all his plans to use it in the west, and obeying the dominant strategic compulsion of the British attack on the Dardanelles, had decided to employ it against Serbia for the salvation of Constantinople and Turkey. While he was in this mood of concession to the Eastern heresy, another wave of pressures caught hold of him. Conrad had been cured by harsh experience of all desire for adventures against Serbia. He was clutching at the crests and passes of the Carpathians. At more than one point the Russian vanguards already overlooked the broad Hungarian plain. One more effort, one more success, and all the floods of Russian manhood would flow ravaging into the homelands of Hungary. Such an event would wreck the empire to its foundations. Week by week the Russian flood mounted. The Austrian dikes and dams were already breaking. The major strategic values asserted themselves upon the Austrian headquarters. Who now cared for Serbia, Italy and Romania? Bulgaria and Turkey seemed relatively meaningless factors. At all costs, the Carpathian front must be held. To all German suggestions of a joint operation against Serbia, Conrad turned a dull ear. Nothing now mattered to him but the hour-to-hour defense of the Eastern Front, and for this he had a plan which in time, space and direction was the expression of his military genius. Somewhere on the Dunajec River, say between Gorlice and Tarnow, there must be an efficient German thrust. Austrian troops would not suffice. There must be a German army capable of crashing through the Russian front and thus turning and undermining their whole line of battle along the summits of the Carpathians. Conrad saw that for him all might be regained by a punch with real Germans at this particular and deadly point. This, then, was what he urged, and to nothing else would he listen. Falkenhayn had already relinquished his dreams of an offensive against the British in France. He had resigned himself to an eastern campaign to relieve Constantinople. He now somewhat easily acceded to Conrad's demands. He certainly responded professionally to the strategic charm of his colleague's conception. He saw this was the place to hit. He saw that German troops alone could strike the blow. By this time the dreaded naval attack upon the Dardanelles had unaccountably dwindled and ceased. The danger was constant, but the urgency had abated, and Conrad pointed the path and clamoured for aid to his forces. So early in April, Falkenhayn, having first been drawn against his will to the east, decided to take all chances at the Dardanelles and succour Conrad. But he said, as generals should always say, if this is worth doing, it is worth doing well. And he said what only those in the highest command can say, we will make a set piece of it. 4 German divisions, which was all that Conrad had dared to ask, would be too few. 4 corps might be enough. Conrad should have double what he asked. The new 11th German Army should be used between Gorlice and Tarnow. In all this conflict of ideas and pressures, it is interesting to notice that the part played by the German Crown Prince. No doubt he had accomplished military advisers, but certainly the tact and diplomacy which he employed deserve attention. On April 1, the Crown Prince had a long conversation with Falkenhayn. The heir to the throne, who had a considerable stake in all that was going forward, began by expounding the paramount importance of the Western Front. He declared his belief that the decision of the war could only be attained in France against the Western powers, and that this would require the use of all the forces of the German army. In his view, this fundamental idea must hold good during the whole war. Thus he showed himself in the fullest accord with Falkenhayn's doctrine. For the present, however, he added, every attempt to reach a decision in the West, now that the Austrian position had attained such importance, was premature. The Russians must first of all be struck down and be made to make a separate peace. Falkenhayn's intention was merely to cripple the Russian power for some considerable time, and therefore not to use more forces against them than necessary. Not thus, in the Crown Prince's view, would the Germans attain the necessary freedom to enable them to carry out their main task, their final task in the West. Far rather was it necessary to put in such strong forces in the East that a decision might be attained there. Here was the policy of the Easterners expressed in the language of the Western school. We have quoted Kuhl. If the Crown Prince ever in fact used such arguments, and this is not yet disputed, he certainly wrapped the shrewdest military council in the coverings most likely to conciliate Falkenhayn. Falkenhayn was persuaded 3/4 of the way. He would not boldly seek the destruction of Russia and suffer all minor punishment elsewhere. But he agreed to throw his reserves upon the East rather than the West, and he agreed further to throw them against Russia in the first instance, rather than against Serbia, for the relief of Constantinople. The plan which Conrad had conceived and which Falkenhayn had agreed to implement with doubled forces was a striking departure from the traditional German methods which Hindenburg and Ludendorff had hitherto, with a single exception at Lodz, consistently employed. Instead of a wide enveloping movement directed against the flanks and rear of the enemy, it was a straightforward frontal attack. There was to be a breakthrough in the center, or, as the French call it, une percée, similar to those so often extravagantly bid for on the Western Front. The sector between Gorlice and Tarnow was about 30 miles wide. Behind the Austrian line between these 2 towns, the German 11th Army began in early April to assemble. It was finally composed of 4 German corps drawn from the French front: the Guard from Alsace, the 10th from the west of Rheims, the 41st from Gorlice, and a composite corps from Lorraine. To these were added the Austrian 6th Corps and a Hungarian cavalry division. In all, 1 cavalry and 10 infantry divisions, about 170,000 men. The 11th Army had 352 field and 146 heavy guns, and the Austrian 4th Army, behind whom they were forming, had 350 field and 103 heavy guns. That is to say, a field gun to about every 45 yards and a heavy gun to every 132 yards. Although these proportions were far surpassed by both sides on the Somme in 1916, they represented in May 1915 the greatest artillery concentration yet prepared. The direction of the Gorlice-Tarnow attack was to be northeast across the foothills between the Vistula and the mountains, and once the Russian line was broken, the Germans would wheel their front until they faced east, thus traversing, as may be seen by the map, the rear of all three Russian armies battling along the Carpathians to the southward. Indeed, to make the operation fruitful in the highest degree, or as Falkenhayn expressed it, to improve the harvest prospects, he suggested to Conrad that the Austrian armies holding the mountains should give way step by step, drawing the enemy after them into Hungary. But Conrad ignored the proposal. He could not bring himself to yield Hungarian soil. He had no desire to encourage his armies to retreat. His efforts had usually been required in the opposite sense. To cover the withdrawal of such important forces from France, lively activity was prescribed along the entire Western Front. The gas attack at Ypres, not by shelling as at Bolimov, but by the continuous discharge of gas from cylinders, which began on April 22, was the most formidable of these destructive enterprises. The precipitate exposure of this deadly device at a time when no German reserves were at hand to exploit its surprising effects was one of the debts which the Western Allies owed to the Western Front. Hindenburg and Ludendorff were likewise ordered to make a diversion in their northern sphere. They seem to have viewed the Gorlice-Tarnow project with restrained enthusiasm. They had almost come to regard the Eastern Front as their preserve. The arrival of Falkenhayn and OHL as prime actors in these scenes, furnished with the reinforcements for which Hindenburg and Ludendorff had long pleaded in vain, could scarcely be welcomed. Moreover, Hindenburg and Ludendorff had only one method, a vast outflanking movement from the north, to march between Riga and Kovno and then drive southwards far behind the Russian front, cutting the main railways which sustained it, was their ideal conception. For this the forces were lacking. The most they could offer by way of diversion was a powerful raid by 3 cavalry supported by 3 infantry divisions into Courland and Lithuania. This operation began at the end of April and no doubt excited Russian concern. Hindenburg's own remarks explain the direction in which his influence was exerted. My headquarters was at first only an indirect participant in the great operation which began at Gorlice. Our first duty within the framework of this mighty enterprise was to tie down strong enemy forces. This was done at first by attacks in the great bend of the Vistula west of Warsaw and on the East Prussian frontier in the direction of Kovno, then on a greater scale by a cavalry sweep into Lithuania and Courland, which began on April 27. The advance of 3 cavalry divisions, supported by the same number of infantry divisions, touched Russia's war zone at a sensitive spot. For the first time the Russians realized that by such an advance their most important railways, which connected the Russian armies with the heart of the country, could be seriously threatened. They threw in large forces to meet our invasion. The battles on Lithuanian soil dragged out until the summer. We found ourselves compelled to send larger forces there, to retain our hold on the occupied region and keep up our pressure on the enemy in these districts which had hitherto been untouched by war. Thus a new German army gradually came into existence. It was given the name of the Niemen Army, from the great river of this region. The Russian forces holding the front against which these dire preparations were progressing consisted of the Third Army under General Radko Dmitriev, who had hitherto found no difficulty in containing the bulk of the Austrian Fourth Army. The greatest pains were taken to conceal from the Russians the gathering of the storm. All German reconnoitering parties were dressed in Austrian uniforms, and until within a few days of the battle, General Dmitriev was quite unaware of what impended upon him. Still less did he suspect its scale and intensity. The German staff officers climbing the hilltops could see the Russian positions laid out before them as on a map. There were 3 lines of loopholed trenches with overhead cover, constituting a single zone of defense. The German reconnoitering parties found the conditions very different from those of the Western Front. No Man's Land was a wide space, 3,000 or 4,000 yards across, through which occasional patrols wandered by night and in which the inhabitants cultivated their fields by day. The tranquility of the countryside was broken only by an occasional splutter of rifle fire or a few desultory shells. The first care of the Germans had been to remove all the inhabitants so that no tales could be told. Meanwhile, enormous dumps of ammunition, 1,200 rounds for every field and 500 to 600 for every heavy battery, were accumulated. The delicate question of the command was adjusted in the following manner. The 11th Army, Austrian and German troops alike, and their offensive were entrusted to General von Mackensen, with Seeckt as his mentor. Mackensen was placed under Conrad and AOK. But these in turn agreed not to give any orders to Mackensen which had not beforehand been approved by Falkenhayn and OHL. And then, lest this procedure should be dilatory, it was understood that in practice OHL would tell Seeckt what to do direct, the formal orders reaching Mackensen as soon as possible through the prescribed ceremonial channel. Thus Austrian dignity was safeguarded, and no inconvenience arose. The 11th Army had taken over the line by April 28, and on the same day Mackensen issued his warning order that the artillery would open on May 1 and that the assault would follow on May 2. The presence of Germans on the front was discovered by the Russians on the 25th, but no reinforcements were asked for by General Dmitriev. Even patrolling and vigilance seem to have sunk to a low ebb. Says Danilov, "Our right front with its huge salient had many weak places. The Russian army was at the end of its power. The uninterrupted fighting in the Carpathians had cost it heavy losses. The deficit in officers and men in many units was terrifying. The lack of arms and munitions was catastrophic. In these circumstances the troops could still do something against the Austrians, but were incapable of stopping serious pressure from an energetic and determined foe." Such was the situation on the eve of the attack. The German artillery registration began during May 1 and gradually increased throughout the afternoon and night into a harassing fire to prevent the Russians from strengthening their defenses. A 2 hours pause was made from 1 to 3 a.m. during the night to give the German patrols opportunity for reconnaissance and their engineers time to destroy wire and obstacles. At 6 a.m. on the 2nd, the 4-hour intense preliminary bombardment began. At this time the storm troops were already in their assaulting positions, and behind them the successive waves of the attack, together with the field batteries destined to accompany it, deployed. In all, 10 divisions were marshaled, only the 10th Corps forming reserves upon either wing. The bombardment was crushing. The Russian overhead cover of earth and sandbags supported on logs was everywhere smashed by the German howitzers and trench mortars. There was scarcely any reply from the hostile artillery. A few batteries that did attempt it were immediately silenced by overwhelming fire. The German infantry, instead of hugging the parapet, stood upright and almost unharmed watched the effects of the bombardment. When at 9 a.m. the trench mortars developed their full intensity, the Russian wire and machine guns flew into the air. At 10 o'clock the trench mortars ceased firing. The German artillery lifted on to the back lines, and through the dust and smoke 30 or 40,000 assaulting infantry charged at a rapid pace. Here and there, says the German account, lone grey figures jumped up and ran back, weaponless in grey fur caps and fluttering, unbuttoned greatcoats, until there was not one remaining. Like a flock of sheep, they fled in wild confusion. Many to be caught in the next line of wire and there slain or captured. Only where there were woods near the front line or where, owing to hilly ground, the bombardment had not done its work, was there any fighting. The front position was carried with a rush, and the Russian counterattacks were hurled back upon their second line. After hard fighting all through May 2, this was stormed in its turn. On the 4th, the 3rd Caucasian Corps sent from the Russian Army Group Reserve attempted to counterattack, but could do no more than cover the retreat. The 11th Army, drawing the Austrian armies on either side forward with them, had now broken completely through the Russian front. Dmitriev's army was annihilated. His divisions, after another week's fighting, could scarcely muster 1,000 men apiece. 140,000 prisoners, 100 guns and 300 machine guns fell during the whole operation to the victors, while the trenches were choked with dead and wounded. It had once more been proved that the Russian army in its weakened condition could not withstand the troops of any first-class nation. The whole of the Russian Carpathian front now became untenable, and everywhere along 100 miles of hard-won summits and passes, the 8th, 11th, and 9th Russian armies retreated with the utmost speed, yielding up march after march the fair province which they had invaded 9 months before and deemed their own forever. Meanwhile much had happened at the Dardanelles. The sudden and, as it proved, final cessation of all efforts by the British Navy to force the straits, which had followed their repulse of the 18th of March, had been succeeded by a cloud of rumors of an impending land attack upon the Gallipoli Peninsula. Very large British forces were known to be gathering in Egypt, and the complete silence and passivity in the fleet betokened extensive preparations for a landing. Meanwhile, the Turks, under German direction, worked feverishly to fortify all possible landing places, and by the middle of April their army on the peninsula had been raised to 8 divisions. Admiral von Usedom, with scarcely any armor-piercing ammunition for his heavy guns, only the mines he had already sown, and no hope of getting more of either, was fully conscious of his weakness in the face of a renewed naval effort. But the flower of the Turkish army was now gathering on the peninsula, and Liman von Sanders, under whose orders stood the valiant Mustafa Kemal, awaited an impending descent by a hostile force with confidence and ardor. Indeed, instructed military opinion in Turkish and German circles, as also at Sir John French's headquarters, held that the operation of landing an army from open boats on beaches, swept by machine guns and modern rifle fire, was probably impossible. To the German Supreme Headquarters, who, knowing the facts, watched the events, it must indeed have seemed strange that the British should be ready to face the appalling risks and sacrifices of a landing, while all the time the main fortress cannons, which held the straits, could each count their armor-piercing shells upon a man's fingers. Perhaps, however, the British would attack by land and sea at the same time or in quick succession. On April 25 the impossible was achieved. From earliest daybreak, Liman von Sanders received the news of a series of landings and attacks on almost all the practicable beaches. Desperate fighting ensued, into which all the Turkish reserves at the end of the peninsula were rapidly drawn. On the beaches and amid the rocky scrub and ravines of the peninsula, a violent struggle at the closest quarters raged remorselessly, and by nightfall on the 26th, after a loss of 20,000 men, more than 30,000 British, Australasian and French troops had established themselves upon the Gallipoli Peninsula. The assailants paused to lend their artillery and supplies, and Liman von Sanders hurried his remaining Turkish divisions to the scene. So critical was his need that he was forced to leave the isthmus of Bulair, with its celebrated lines and his sole means of retreat utterly unguarded. On April 28, the British and French troops on the tip of the peninsula resumed their advance, and the furious first battle of Krithia was fought. The Turks withstood the invaders, weakened by their terrible losses and only lightly supported by field artillery, and yielded scarcely a mile of the precious ground. Still, it seemed to the German-Turkish command that their enemies had overcome the main obstacle. They had established themselves on shore, or the Turkish reserves were engaged. The Turkish line of retreat could be cut at any moment by a further descent from the sea. No one could tell what reserves the ships might bring, or on what new point they would fall. There was nothing but to fight on stubbornly. Europe, therefore, at the end of the first week in May, took count of two new events of the first magnitude: the wonderful landing of the Allies upon Gallipoli and the crashing Russian defeat in North Galicia. As had been feared, wrote Falkenhayn, the English set foot on the Gallipoli peninsula on April 25. Italy's entry into the ranks of the enemy became daily more probable. The negotiations between the Allies and Italy had in fact been virtually completed, but the naval and military conventions were still being settled in Paris. The naval arrangements, which it had become my duty to conduct on behalf of the Allies, presented no great difficulty. Our command of the sea at that time was absolute, and it was easy to give our hoped-for new ally whatever naval aid she might ask. But the essence of the military convention was that the Russians should maintain at least 40 divisions in Galicia and should press the Austrians there with all their might. When the discussions began, the Italians might well have expected an immediate Russian invasion of Hungary. Before they ended, they were confronted with the apparition of Gorlice Tarnow and the spectacle of a general Russian retreat from the Carpathians. By the middle of May, the magnitude of the Russian disasters in Galicia was plain. Moreover, the British attacks on the Aubert Ridge in France, upon which many vain hopes had been built, had also been easily repulsed with heavy slaughter. Everywhere the Germans struck or defended themselves with invincible strength and skill. Far larger Austrian forces would now be available to meet the Italian armies. The military position of the Allies had sensibly worsened. There always, however, remained the ding-dong battle on the Gallipoli peninsula, the military prodigy of the landing, and the apparent certainty that the amphibious power of Britain would enable her to beat down and break up the Turkish Empire, with all that would entail. The two events, the victory and the defeat, balanced each other. The negotiations continued. The conventions were signed. On May 23, Italy ordered the general mobilization of her armies and declared war against Austria. At midnight on the 24th, the Italian army, which had long been on a war footing, crossed the Austrian frontier, and a fourth great power joined the Allies.